You've got 10 seconds to stand up and put your hands behind your back.
Officer, I am paralyzed. I physically cannot stand. I'm the one who called 911 about the robbery. You are detaining the wrong person. I've seen this before.
Don't play games with me.
You are violating my Fourth Amendment rights and the ADA.
That's the guy who called.
Last chance. I cannot stand.
Officer Calvin Presley had arrived at the West Side Medical Commons that Thursday morning, responding to a dispatch call about a robbery in progress. The description relayed was simple: black male, hoodie. When Presley pulled into the parking lot, scanned the scene, and saw Patrick Johnson, 56 years old, black, wearing a black hoodie, sitting in a wheelchair near the clinic entrance, he walked straight toward him. He walked past the woman whose laptop had just been stolen from her car. He walked past the bystanders already pointing toward the parking lot where the actual suspect had fled. He had his man. He was sure of it. What Officer Calvin Presley did not know yet, what he was about to learn in the worst possible way, was that he had just targeted the man who made the 911 call. That the man in front of him had a bullet lodged in his memory from a UN peacekeeping mission that cost him the use of his legs. That a dozen phones were already recording. That the body cam clipped to his own chest was capturing every second, and that his decision to grab that wheelchair and yank Patrick Johnson forward onto the asphalt of that parking lot would not only end his career before it had barely begun, but would result in a $7.5 million settlement that would become a case study in what happens when bias is allowed to wear a badge. Before we go further, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We genuinely love seeing who this story reaches. And if you believe a paralyzed veteran who called 911 to protect his community deserves better than being dragged out of his wheelchair and handcuffed on the pavement, like this video and subscribe. This story deserves to be seen. The West Side Medical Commons on a humid Thursday morning had the steady, purposeful energy of a place that existed specifically for people rebuilding their lives. Paratransit vans idled at the curb. Patients moved through the automatic doors with canes, walkers, and wheelchairs. Nurses on break stood near the shaded side entrance, coffee cups in hand, talking quietly before the next session began. The outpatient wing specialized in spinal rehabilitation, and for many of the people who came through those doors, it was one of the few places in the world where their situation was entirely normal, expected even. Patrick Johnson had been one of those people for nearly a decade. He was 56 years old, a decorated veteran of a United States-backed UN peacekeeping mission in a conflict zone that most Americans had already forgotten by the time he came home. He didn't come home the way he left. A sniper's round had found his T10 vertebra on a morning that started like any other, and when he woke up in a field hospital 2 days later, the world below his waist had gone permanently silent. The years since had been a long, disciplined process of relearning everything: how to move through a world that wasn't built for him, how to advocate for himself in systems that preferred to overlook him, and how to hold on to the identity of a man who had served his country even when that country didn't always recognize him back. He had emerged from that process with something harder and more durable than bitterness: a precise working knowledge of the United States Constitution, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and exactly what his rights were in any situation he was likely to face. He came to West Side Medical Commons every week for physical therapy. The routine was as familiar as breathing: paratransit pickup from home, session with his PT, wait near the shaded entrance for the return ride. He had done it so many times that he barely thought about the individual steps anymore. He simply moved through them. This particular Thursday morning, he had wheeled himself to his usual spot near the entrance after his session, settling into the shade to wait. He was wearing a black hoodie. The clinic ran its air conditioning cold, and he had learned years ago to dress for the temperature inside rather than the weather out. His VA medical bracelet sat on his left wrist, the way it always did. His phone was in his hand. He was waiting. That was when he saw the man. Roughly 30 feet away, near a row of parked vehicles along the far edge of the lot, a figure moved quickly and deliberately toward a silver sedan. In one smooth motion, the man smashed the passenger window, reached inside, and came back out with a laptop bag before breaking into a run toward the far exit. It happened in under 10 seconds. Patrick didn't hesitate. He pulled up his keypad and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I'm at Westside Medical Commons, outpatient entrance, Patrick said, his voice calm and precise, the voice of a man trained to report under pressure. I just witnessed a vehicle break-in and theft. The suspect is a black male in a dark hoodie, running toward the eastern parking exit carrying a laptop bag. The dispatcher confirmed the information. Patrick kept watching, tracking the direction the man had gone, ready to give an update. He didn't see the man stop. He didn't see him turn around. He didn't realize until the figure was already moving back across the lot, directly toward him, that being the witness in a wheelchair had just made him the easiest secondary target in the area. The man covered the distance fast. He reached Patrick, grabbed the wallet from the pouch on the side of the chair, snatched the phone mid-call from Patrick's hand, and kept moving without a word. Gone in seconds. Patrick sat with empty hands, the phone call dead, and the quiet understanding that the military ID the police would have needed to identify him had just left with a thief running toward the highway. He sat still in the morning heat and waited for the patrol car he had summoned. Officer Calvin Presley was 42 years old and had only been on the force for a short time. A second career cop who had come to law enforcement later in life and carried with him a set of assumptions that had never been formally challenged. There were complaints in his personnel file. Not many, but enough. Documented incidents in which Presley had acted on race and profile before evidence. Situations that had been reviewed, labeled unsubstantiated, and filed away without consequence. The pattern existed on paper. No one had done anything with it. When the dispatch call came through that morning, robbery, the Westside Medical Commons, black male in a hoodie, Presley was already close. He pulled into the lot less than 4 minutes after the call. He stepped out of the cruiser. His eyes moved across the scene. They passed over the woman standing near her shattered car window. They passed over the two bystanders already gesturing toward the far exit, pointing in the direction the suspect had fled. They settled on Patrick Johnson, wheelchair, black hoodie, black man, sitting alone near the clinic entrance. Presley's hand moved to his taser. He started walking. "Sir," he said, the word landing like a door closing, "you match the description." Patrick did not raise his voice. That, more than anything else, seemed to unsettle Officer Presley. "Sir, I need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back," Presley repeated. Oro planting himself directly in front of the wheelchair, feet apart, chin slightly raised, the posture of a man performing authority rather than exercising it. "Officer," Patrick said, "I'm a paraplegic veteran. I'm physically incapable of standing. I am also the person who placed the 911 call that brought you here. I was robbed while making that call. My wallet and my military ID were taken by the same suspect I reported. I am not your perpetrator. I am your witness," he paused, "and your victim." Presley stared at him. Something moved behind his eyes, not doubt exactly, but the brief flicker of a man who has heard something that doesn't fit the picture he's already drawn. The flicker passed. The picture won. "That's a real convenient story," Presley said. This is the part that psychologists who study law enforcement behavior call confirmation bias in action, and it is more dangerous in a badge than almost anywhere else. Confirmation bias is the cognitive tendency to search for, interpret, and prioritize information that confirms what you already believe, while dismissing evidence that contradicts it. Presley had arrived at the scene with a description and a conclusion. Everything Patrick said after that, no matter how logical, no matter how verifiable, was filtered through a mind that had already decided. The wheelchair didn't register as evidence of paralysis. It registered as a prop. The medical clinic behind Patrick didn't suggest a spinal patient. It suggested a clever location for a scam. The calmer Patrick remained, the more suspicious Presley became. Because in Presley's framework, innocent people were nervous and guilty people played games. He had it exactly backwards. The woman whose car window had been smashed stepped forward from behind the cluster of bystanders. "Excuse me, he called the police," she said, pointing at Patrick, her voice tight with urgency. "He's the one who reported it. He was sitting right there when it happened. He didn't rob anyone." Presley turned to her with the flat, dismissive patience of someone tolerating an interruption. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and let me do my job." "But he's..." "Step back." She stopped. Around her, phones were already out. A teenager near the clinic entrance had his arm raised at shoulder height, camera steady. An older man in a blue cardigan stood frozen near the paratransit curb, recording without blinking. As the crowd had understood what was happening before Presley had, and they were doing the only thing available to them. Patrick, for his part, remained extraordinarily still, not the stillness of fear, the stillness of discipline. He knew that movement would be misread, that volume would be misread, that anything resembling agitation would hand Presley exactly the narrative he was building. So he spoke instead, quietly and with the precision of someone who had spent years learning that knowledge was the only weapon that couldn't be confiscated. "Officer, under the Fourth Amendment, you need reasonable articulable suspicion to detain me. A vague dispatch description does not meet that threshold when the physical evidence in front of you contradicts it. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you are required to provide reasonable accommodation in this interaction, which means you cannot demand I perform a physical action my documented medical condition makes impossible. I am not being uncooperative. I am being accurate." Presley's face changed, not dramatically, just a tightening around the jaw, a slight forward shift in weight. He had expected deflection or panic, the usual responses that let him control the tempo of an encounter. What he had not expected was a man who knew the law better than he did, calmly citing it from a wheelchair in a parking lot. And because Presley lacked the training and self-awareness to recognize that composure as innocence, he read it as manipulation, the calculated calm of someone running a con. He walked slowly around the wheelchair in a half circle, looking down. But he reached out with the toe of his boot and tapped Patrick's left leg once, then his right, as if testing the firmness of furniture. Patrick said nothing. He let the indignity sit between them without reaction. Around the growing crowd, a woman audibly exhaled in disgust. "I think this chair's a prop," Presley said, almost to himself. "I think you're a lot more mobile than you're letting on." He was standing in front of a spinal rehabilitation clinic. The sign was visible from where he stood. None of it reached him. The crowd had grown to nearly 20 people, phones everywhere, voices tightening. Presley could feel the weight of their judgment, and rather than pause, rather than ask a single question of the clinic staff 10 feet away, he made the decision that small, cornered egos so often make. He decided that what he needed, more than accuracy, was the last word. "I've given you every opportunity," he said. "If you can't stand up, I'll help you." He reached back and grabbed the handles of the wheelchair. The crowd went silent. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. It would take lawyers, investigators, and a civil court nearly 2 years to fully account for all of it. Presley yanked the wheelchair handles backward and then shoved forward in one sharp, jerking motion, the kind of move that might work on a person whose legs would instinctively catch them. Patrick's legs did not catch him. They never would. Without the muscle engagement that an able-bodied person relies on automatically and unconsciously to maintain balance, his upper body had nothing beneath it. He pitched forward out of the seat like dead weight, which is exactly what his lower half was, and the wheelchair bucked sideways from the force, clattering against the asphalt with a hollow metallic crack. Patrick's shoulder hit first, then his head, a sound that was not loud but was dense and final, the kind of sound that doesn't echo so much as land, and several people in the crowd flinched as though they had felt it themselves. Then the screaming started. Here is what Patrick felt in those first seconds, and it matters that you understand this. He felt nothing below the waist. Not impact, not the scrape of pavement, nothing. The paralysis that Presley had dismissed as a performance was precisely and completely real, which meant that while a standing person might have absorbed some of the fall through their legs, Patrick absorbed all of it through his spine, his shoulder, and his skull. What he did feel was a deep, nauseating pressure radiating from his mid-back, his T10 injury site, the precise location where a sniper's bullet had already done its worst, and then a wave of disorientation that narrowed his vision at the edges. He was face down on hot asphalt in a medical parking lot, unable to move his lower body, with a crowd screaming around him and the sound of his own wheelchair still rocking somewhere behind him. The physical pain was significant. The humiliation was a different category of thing entirely, the kind that doesn't heal the way tissue does. Presley did not stop. This is the detail that would later prove most damaging in the legal proceedings, because stopping, pausing for even a moment to reassess, would have been the instinct of an officer acting in good faith. Instead, he dropped to one knee, grabbed Patrick's arms, and forced them behind his back. Patrick, whose core muscles were working overtime simply to stabilize his spine against the pavement, could not comply with the movement even if he had wanted to. Presley interpreted this as resistance. "Stop fighting me," he said, and pressed Patrick's face down against the asphalt. "He's paralyzed," a woman shouted from somewhere behind the growing ring of onlookers. "He cannot move his legs. He is paralyzed." The clinic's front doors burst open. A nurse in dark blue scrubs crossed the distance at a near run, her ID badge swinging, already calling back over her shoulder to someone inside. "Call the supervisor, now." Around the scene, phones were held at eye level, arms steady, recording with the focused silence of people who understood they were documenting something that needed to be seen. Someone near the curb said loudly, "We have all of this, every second of it." Presley didn't look up. The second patrol car arrived 4 minutes later. Sergeant Alan Miller stepped out slowly, not because he was unhurried, but because experienced officers assess before they move, and what Miller saw in the first 3 seconds told him enough to require a steady approach. He was in his early 50s, while broad-shouldered, with the quiet authority of someone who had supervised enough scenes to know when one had gone wrong before anyone admitted it. His eyes moved from the crowd to the handcuffed man on the pavement, and then to two things in quick succession: the VA medical bracelet on Patrick's left wrist and the large mounted sign above the clinic entrance that read, "Westside Spinal Rehabilitation Center." He walked directly to the head nurse, who had been standing at the edge of the scene with barely contained fury. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Miller listened, nodded once. His expression did not change so much as solidify. He turned and walked back toward Presley with the deliberate pace of a man controlling something he did not want to lose control of in public. "Uncuff this man," Miller said, not loudly, but with a quality that cut straight through the crowd noise. Presley looked up. "Sarge, I was responding to a robbery call, and this individual. Uncuff him right now." The second time, it carried. "You have a decorated, paralyzed veteran face down on the pavement in front of a spinal clinic. You will uncuff him this instant." The crowd went completely silent. Not the tense silence of before, a different kind, the held breath of people watching something shift. Presley's hands moved to the cuffs. His face, which had carried the tight confidence of a man certain he was right, had gone the pale, recalculating color of a man beginning to understand that he was not. The EMTs moved in quietly and lifted Patrick with practiced care, checking his neck and spine with the focused attention of people who understood exactly what kind of injury they were dealing with. Patrick said nothing. He let them work. He stared at the sky above the parking lot, blue and indifferent, and breathed. Presley stood a few feet away, alone in the geography of the scene, now that Miller had stepped back to coordinate the medical response. The crowd was still there, the phones were still up, and the small red light on Presley's own body cam blinked steadily on his chest, recording everything, the way it had been recording from the moment he stepped out of his car. The internal affairs notification was filed before Patrick had finished being evaluated by the EMTs. Sergeant Miller saw to that personally, which was itself a statement, a supervisor moving against his own department's officer without waiting to be asked, without allowing the usual bureaucratic cooling-off period that so often gives bad conduct room to be reframed. By the time Patrick was transported for a full spinal assessment that afternoon, the incident report had been flagged, the body cam footage had been secured, and the wheels of a process that Presley had never anticipated were already turning. The media had the story within 24 hours. Not because anyone leaked it, because 17 people in that parking lot had already posted their footage before Miller's patrol car left the scene. By the following morning, the phrase, "paralyzed veteran, dragged from wheelchair," had become a headline on every major national outlet. And the videos, Presley's jerk of the handles, the collapse, the sound, the nurse running, Miller's face when he heard the truth, had been watched millions of times. The internet, which often moves faster than justice and with considerably less accuracy, had in this case moved fast and gotten every detail exactly right. Patrick watched the coverage from a hospital bed with the same composed expression he had worn in the parking lot. His spinal injury had been aggravated, not catastrophically, but significantly enough to require additional treatment and to establish with clinical precision that the fall had caused measurable physical harm. He was in pain. He was exhausted. And he had already decided, with the clarity that had defined him since long before any of this, exactly what he intended to do about it. But he was not interested in revenge. Revenge is emotional and imprecise, and Patrick Johnson had not survived a combat tour, a paralysis diagnosis, and a decade of navigating the world from a wheelchair by being imprecise. What he wanted was accountability, specific, documented, structural accountability of the kind that changes how institutions behave rather than simply punishing an individual and moving on. Within a week of the incident, he had contacted one of the most respected civil rights litigation firms in the state. The attorneys who met with him later described the experience as unusual. Their client arrived having already organized his own case notes, cited the relevant statutes, and outlined the legal framework more coherently than some lawyers they had worked with. But years of studying the Constitution, not as theory but as a survival tool, had prepared him for exactly this room. The legal strategy that emerged was built on 5 interlocking claims, and understanding them matters because each one reflects a real protection that exists in American law and that was violated in that parking lot. The first was an ADA violation. The Americans with Disabilities Act explicitly requires law enforcement to make reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities during interactions, and commanding a paraplegic man to stand constitutes a fundamental failure of that obligation. The second was excessive force, the physical act of pulling a paralyzed person from a wheelchair without medical justification meets the legal threshold for force that is objectively unreasonable under Graham v. Connor, at the landmark Supreme Court standard. The third was false arrest. Presley had no probable cause, only a vague description that Patrick visibly and provably did not fit once basic inquiry was made. The fourth was racial profiling. The pattern of Presley bypassing non-black bystanders to target Patrick, combined with his prior complaint history, established the basis for a race-based discrimination claim. The fifth was emotional distress, both negligent and intentional, because what Patrick experienced on that pavement in front of a crowd in handcuffs was not merely a physical injury. The evidence assembled itself almost without effort. The body cam footage was the foundation, and it was devastating, because Presley's written incident report described a combative suspect who refused lawful commands, while the footage showed a calm man in a wheelchair citing legal statutes before being physically dumped onto the ground. Juries and judges understand body cam footage. They understand it viscerally, in a way that written reports cannot compete with. Layered on top of that were the 17 civilian recordings, each capturing a slightly different angle of the same indefensible sequence of events. And then, most consequentially, came Presley's personnel file. The 4 prior complaints, all dismissed, all documenting the same pattern of racially skewed assumptions and disproportionate escalation. A single incident can be argued as an error in judgment. A documented pattern across multiple victims argues something else entirely. Presley's internal affairs interview lasted several hours. He gave inconsistent accounts of the sequence of events, contradicting both the footage and his own written report. When the investigator pressed him on why he had dismissed Patrick's explanation, he said, and this quote entered the public record when the settlement was filed, "I thought he was faking." He had thought a man was faking paraplegia in front of a spinal rehabilitation clinic after being told by multiple witnesses, a trained nurse and the patient himself, that the condition was real. The department, which had already begun distancing itself publicly, received everything it needed from that one sentence. The city settled for $7.5 million. They did not go to trial, a decision driven not by generosity but by calculation, because the footage, the pattern, the medical evidence in Presley's own statement made a courtroom an unacceptable risk. A public statement was issued acknowledging that the incident did not reflect the standards of conduct the department required. It was carefully worded in the way that institutional apologies always are, designed to express regret without fully admitting the scope of what had been allowed to fester for years in Presley's personnel file. Calvin Presley was terminated following the conclusion of the internal affairs investigation. The findings cited gross misconduct, excessive force, and demonstrated racial bias, the same bias that had been documented, dismissed, and filed away 4 times before it put a paralyzed veteran on the pavement. He was subsequently reported to the National Law Enforcement Decertification Database, which meant that no police department in the country could hire him without full knowledge of what he had done. His badge was surrendered on a Tuesday morning in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes. He had been on the force for less than 3 years. The money did not fix the nightmares. Patrick had not expected it to. In the weeks after the incident, he found himself waking at odd hours with the particular disorientation of a man whose body had been violated in a way that bypassed the numbness his paralysis provided. He couldn't feel the pavement in his legs, but he could feel the memory of it in everything else. The way he tensed when a stranger approached his wheelchair from behind, the half-second of recalibration he needed each morning before he could trust the day ahead. He had survived a sniper round and a decade of rebuilding. He was not broken by a parking lot, but he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that something had shifted, and that dignity, however carefully maintained in the moment, does not make a person immune to the weight of what it cost to maintain it. He did not withdraw. He processed the way disciplined people do, and he kept his appointments. 3 weeks after the incident, a pawnshop clerk in a neighboring county ran a routine serial number check on a laptop brought in by a walk-in customer and got an immediate hit. Stolen property, active case. The man attempting to sell it was detained within the hour. Patrick's wallet was in his bag. His military ID was there too, slightly bent at the corner but intact. The same ID that might have ended everything in that parking lot before it began, had the thief not taken it. The actual perpetrator, the man in the black hoodie who had robbed a woman's car and then turned around to rob the witness reporting him, was arrested, charged, and later convicted. The irony did not require commentary. The evidence had always existed. It had simply been in the wrong hands on the wrong morning. The veterans community responded to Patrick's story with the focused intensity of people who recognized something specific in it, not just racial injustice, not just police misconduct, but the particular vulnerability of a disabled veteran in a system that celebrates military service in the abstract while failing to protect the people who actually performed it. A town hall was organized by a coalition of local veterans organizations, attended by hundreds, including representatives from the police department who arrived with the subdued body language of institutions that have run out of deniable positions. The department announced 3 concrete policy changes in the weeks that followed. Mandatory ADA compliance training for all active officers with annual renewal requirements, implicit bias retraining built around documented case studies rather than the abstract diversity seminars that research has consistently shown to have little measurable effect. And enhanced supervision protocols requiring a senior officer to be contactable and responsive during any detention involving a vulnerable individual. These were not symbolic gestures. They were written into departmental policy and attached to the employment conditions of every officer on the force. It is worth pausing on what this case teaches because the lessons are not subtle and they do not belong only to law enforcement. Confirmation bias, the mechanism that drove Presley from the moment he saw a black man in a hoodie and stopped seeing anything else, is not a character flaw exclusive to bad people. It is a cognitive pattern that operates in all human minds, which is precisely why institutions that give individuals enormous power over other people's lives must build structural safeguards against it. Training, supervision, accountability, and consequences are not punishments for bias. They are the architecture that prevents bias from becoming policy. Presley had 4 complaints in his file, 4 documented moments when the pattern announced itself. The system read those complaints,